Welcome to a new episode of Inside the Economist's Mind. Today we're plunging into a fundamental concept that shapes the fortunes of nations: economic growth. Think of it as the engine that drives a country's progress, influencing everything from job opportunities to living standards.
Exactly. And in this deep dive, we're going to unpack exactly what economic growth means, how we actually measure it, and some of the crucial factors that either fuel it or maybe put the brakes on.
Now, I know the world of economics can sometimes feel like a maze, right? All that jargon and complicated
Yeah.
formulas. But don't worry, our mission today is to cut through the complexity. We want to equip you with a really solid understanding of the nuts and bolts of economic growth.
Especially focusing on that all-important metric, gross domestic product or GDP.
Okay, let's unpack this. What exactly are we talking about when we say economic growth?
Well, at its core, economic growth simply means an increase in the size of a country's economy over a period of time. And when we talk about the size of the economy, the standard measure is the total value of all the goods and services produced within that country. That's gross domestic product, GDP.
Right, so more stuff being made, more services being offered. That's the basic idea. But I remember reading something about nominal versus real GDP. What's the difference there? That always trips people up a bit.
Yeah, it's a crucial distinction. Think of nominal GDP as the uh, total price tag of everything made in the economy. Now, that price tag can go up for two reasons.
Okay.
Either we're actually making more stuff, or the prices of the stuff we're already making have just increased in inflation, basically.
Right.
Real GDP, on the other hand, strips away those price changes. It tries to tell us if we're actually producing more goods and services, more volume.
Ah, okay.
That's really the true measure of economic growth in terms of actual output.
That makes much more sense. So while a headline might shout about, say, 6% growth, if most of that's just higher prices, you're not actually getting more goods and services in real terms.
Exactly.
The source material had a good example with apples, didn't it? Can you remind us of that?
Sure. Imagine an economy that only produces apples. Simple, right?
Yep.
In year one, they produce 100 kilograms of apples at $2 per kilo. So their total production value, the nominal GDP, is $200.
Okay, 100 kilos at $2.
Okay.
Got it.
In year two, they produce slightly more, 104 kilograms, but the price is also nudged up maybe to $2.05 per kilo. Now, the total dollar value is $213.20.
So the nominal GDP growth, just looking at the dollar values, that's from $213.20, which is about 6.6%.
Exactly right, 6.6%. But if we look at the real growth, we're only considering the increase in the quantity of apples produced.
The actual apple.
Yes, from 100 kilograms to 104 kilograms, that's a 4% increase.
Ah, I see.
So in this case, the nominal growth is higher, 6.6%, because it's been inflated by that price increase. That's why economists generally focus on real GDP.
Right. It gives a clearer picture of the actual change in production volume. Got it. So how do we even get a handle on measuring all this production across a whole economy? Not just apples. I imagine it's a massive data gathering exercise.
Oh, it is huge. In Australia, for example, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the ADS, they're the key player here.
Right.
They collect a vast amount of data from households, businesses, government agencies every quarter.
Every 3 months.
Yep. And interestingly, economists don't put all their eggs in one basket when measuring GDP. They actually look at it from three different angles.
3 ways. Okay, lay it on us. What are they?
Well, the first is GDP.
Okay.
GDP for production. That looks at the total value added from all the goods and services produced.
Okay, the production side.
The second is GDPI, I for income. That sums up all the income-generated wages paid to employees, profits earned by businesses, plus taxes minus subsidies.
Right, where the money goes.
And the third is GDPE, for expenditure. This tracks the total value of spending by consumers, businesses, and governments on final goods and services.
So production, income, and expenditure. They're all trying to measure the same underlying thing, right? The overall economic activity.
Precisely. Think of it like measuring a swimming pool. You can look at how much water went in, how high the water level is, or maybe how many people are swimming different angles on the same overall quantity.
That's a good analogy.
In theory, these three measures, GDPP, GDPI, GDPE, should all arrive at the same number.
Should being the operative word?
Well, yes. In the real world, data is never perfect. There are timing issues, things get missed, a lot has to be estimated, so you can get slightly different results.
Ah, okay.
That's why in Australia, the ABS and economists often look at the average of these three measures. It's called GDP-A for average.
Oh, okay.
It tends to give a more robust overall picture, smoothing out some of those potential discrepancies in the individual measures.
That makes sense, averaging it out. Now, GDP seems like the go-to measure for how an economy is doing. It's everywhere in the news. But are there things it doesn't really tell us? Are there like blind spots?
Absolutely. Big ones, actually. While GDP is a vital indicator, it definitely doesn't capture the full picture of a nation's well-being or, quality of life.
Like what, for example?
Think about unpaid work. All the volunteering, the community work, incredibly valuable, right? But it doesn't register in the official GDP numbers.
Right.
Or childcare. If a parent stays home to care for their children, that activity, however valuable, doesn't directly add to GDP.
But if they pay for childcare.
Exactly. If they pay for childcare, that expense is included in GDP because it's a market transaction.
Wow, that's a really eye-opening point. So all that unpaid work holding families and communities together doesn't even nudge the official economic needle. That makes you think about what GDP is really measuring.
It really does. It's focused primarily on market-based activity.
What else does it miss?
Well, GDP itself can be misleading if you don't consider population changes.
How so?
Imagine GDP grows by, say, 2%.
Yeah.
Sounds okay, right? But if the population grows by 4% in the same period...
Then GDP per person has actually gone down.
Precisely. The average person is technically worse off in terms of their share of the economic pie, even though the total pie got slightly bigger. GDP also tells us nothing about how evenly income is distributed.
Right, so a rising tide doesn't necessarily lift all boats equally. You could have soaring GDP, but also soaring inequality.
Exactly. A high GDP could mask significant gaps between the rich and poor.
And the source mentioned something about natural disasters, too. How does that work?
Yeah, that's a counterintuitive one. After a natural disaster, like a flood or a fire, the spending on rebuilding infrastructure, fixing roads, houses, businesses, that activity actually counts towards GDP.
So GDP goes up.
It can, yes.
Yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily mean the country is genuinely better off. We're often just replacing what was lost.
Right, you're just getting back to where you were, maybe, not actually progressing.
Correct. So GDP can sometimes paint a picture of growth that doesn't align with overall improvements in quality of life or well-being. It's a measure of output, not necessarily welfare.
Okay, so GDP is a key measure of the size of the economic pie, but it doesn't tell us everything about how that pie is baked, who gets a slice, or even if the pie is actually making people happier or better off.
That's a good way to put it.
Now let's shift gears a bit. The source talked about aggregate demand. What is that, and how does it relate to GDP?
Okay, aggregate demand, or AD. It's essentially the total level of spending in the economy on domestically produced goods and services.
Total spending.
Yes. And when we measure it, it's actually equivalent to that expenditure measure of GDP we talked about earlier, GDPE.
Okay, so AD and GDPE are basically the same thing.
Conceptually, yes. The formula economists use breaks aggregate demand down into four main components. It's AD equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M.
Okay, C plus I plus G plus XM. Let's take those one by one. C, that's consumption, right? Just what households spend.
Exactly. Household consumption, spending on everyday things like rent, groceries, utilities, cars, holidays, you name it.
And it's the biggest part.
It is, yeah. Usually makes up the largest chunk of aggregate demand in most developed economies. And the main driver of how much households spend is their income, which we often denote as Y.
Okay, income drives consumption.
Right. The basic relationship here is that income that isn't spent is saved, S. So Y equals C plus S.
Income equals consumption plus saving.
And related to this is a concept called the marginal propensity to consume, or MPC.
The MPC, it sounds technical.
It just means how much extra people tend to spend when they get an extra dollar of income. If your MPC is 0.8, it means you spend 80 cents of every extra dollar you receive and save 20 cents.
Right, the tendency to spend rather than save that extra bit. Okay, what about I, investment? What kind of spending falls into that category?
So in economics, investment isn't usually about buying stocks and shares. It's about spending that increases the economy's future capacity to produce things.
Okay, so like physical stuff.
Yes, mostly. Businesses building new factories or buying new machinery, that's investment. Households buying newly built houses is also counted as investment. Plus, spending on infrastructure, like roads or power grids.
What about non-physical things?
Good point. It also includes investment in intangible assets, things like research and development, R&D, creating new software, artistic originals, things that boost future productivity.
And what influences how much businesses and households invest?
A few key things. Interest rates are a big one. Lower rates make borrowing cheaper, which can encourage investment. How profitable businesses expect to be in the future is crucial too.
Makes sense. Optimism helps.
Definitely. Government policies like tax incentives or regulations also play a role. And of course, technological changes can spur new waves of investment.
And you mentioned household expectations earlier, too.
Yes, absolutely. Household expectations about their future income and their current level of wealth significantly impact their spending and investment decisions, like buying a house.
Okay, so investment is about building for the future, influenced by costs, expectations, and policy. Next up is G, government spending. That seems pretty straightforward.
It is mostly government spending. G covers all the purchases of goods and services by federal, state, and local governments. Think hospitals, schools, defense, building roads, paying public servants.
All that.
Yeah. It's often useful to think about it in two parts. There's structural spending, the sort of ongoing baseline spending on essential services that happens regardless of the economy's state.
Okay.
And then there's cyclical spending. This is spending that governments might adjust depending on whether the economy is booming or struggling,
Bikes.
like increasing unemployment benefits or spending on infrastructure projects during a downturn to support demand. It acts as a bit of an automatic stabilizer.
That makes sense. A kind of built-in shock absorber for the economy. Finally, we have net exports, X minus M. So that's the difference between what we sell to other countries and what we buy from them.
Exactly. X is exports goods and services we produce here and sell overseas. M is imports goods and services produced overseas that we buy.
And why do we subtract imports?
Because GDP, and therefore aggregate demand, is about spending on goods and services produced within our country's borders. Imports are produced elsewhere, so we subtract the spending on them to avoid overcounting domestic demand.
Got it. What drives exports?
A lot depends on how well our trading partners' economies are doing. If they're growing strongly, they tend to buy more from us.
Like Australia selling iron ore and coal to China when their economy was booming.
Precisely. The exchange rate of the Australian dollar is also really important. A lower dollar makes our exports cheaper for foreigners, potentially boosting demand.
And imports, what affects them?
How much we import often depends on the strength of the other parts of our aggregate demand. If consumers are spending a lot or businesses are investing heavily, some of that spending will inevitably be on imported goods or machinery.
Right. And the exchange rate matters here, too.
Yes, but in the opposite way. A stronger Australian dollar makes imports cheaper for us, which can lead to higher import volumes.
Okay, so C plus I plus G plus XM gives us the total demand in the economy. And I remember the source mentioning something about a multiplier effect. How does that fit in?
Ah, yes, the simple multiplier. This is a really important concept. It explains how an initial change in one of the components of spending, like investment or government spending, can actually lead to a larger overall change in GDP.
Larger. How does that work?
Think about an example. Let's say a business decides to invest $10 million in building a new wind farm.
Okay.
That $10 million doesn't just disappear. It becomes income for the engineers, construction workers, suppliers involved in building the farm.
Right, they get paid.
Now, what do those people do with their extra income? They spend some of it, right? Based on their marginal propensity to consume, MPC.
Ah, the MPC again?
Yep. Let's say their average MPC is 0.8. They'll spend 80% of that new income, which is $8 million, on other goods and services, groceries, clothes, maybe a new car. That $8 million then becomes income for the grocers, retailers, car dealers, who will then spend a portion of their new income, say another 80%, $6.4 million, and so on.
So it's not just a one-for-one increase. That initial investment has a kind of knock-on effect, like throwing a pebble in a pond and watching the ripples spread outwards?
Exactly. It creates this ripple effect or chain reaction of spending throughout the economy. Each round of spending generates more income, which leads to more spending, although each round gets smaller because some income is saved or leaks out through taxes or imports.
So that initial $10 billion investment doesn't just add $10 million to GDP, it has a multiplied impact. How do we calculate that multiplier?
The simple formula for the multiplier, often called K, is K1 divided by 1 minus MPC.
Okay, K11, 1 MPC.
So in our wind farm example with an MPC of 0.8, the multiplier would be 1.8, which is 1.2.
Which equals 5.
Exactly, a multiplier of 5. This means that the initial $10 million investment could potentially lead to a total increase in GDP of $50 million. 10 million times 5.
Wow, that's a significant amplification. Are there real-world examples where we've seen this multiplier really kick in?
Government stimulus packages during recessions are often designed with this in mind.
Right.
When governments increase spending, G, or cut taxes, which boosts C, the idea is that the initial injection of money will be multiplied through the economy, leading to a larger overall increase in economic activity and helping to counteract the downturn. The size of the actual multiplier is debated among economists, but the principle is well established.
Okay, so understanding these drivers of aggregate demand and the multiplier is clearly key to understanding economic growth from the spending side. Now, what about the supply side of the equation? The source also talked about aggregate supply.
Right. Aggregate supply, or AS, is the other side of the coin. It refers to the total output of goods and services that the economy is capable of producing.
The economy's productive capacity.
Exactly. And this capacity is determined by two main things: the resources available, the inputs, and how efficiently we use those inputs, which is productivity.
What are the main inputs?
The two key inputs are usually considered to be labor and capital.
Okay.
The amount of labor available depends on factors like the size of the working age population and the labor force participation rate. That's the proportion of people who are either working or actively looking for work.
And capital. We talked about investment adding to capital earlier.
Yes. Capital includes the physical, tangible things like buildings, machinery, computers, infrastructure, but it also includes intangible capital, like the knowledge gained from R&D, software, databases, brand equity.
So more labor and more capital mean we can potentially produce more.
Correct. But how much more also depends crucially on productivity.
Right. You mentioned productivity. Where does that fit in? How is it defined?
Productivity is essentially about how much output we can generate with a given amount of inputs, labor and capital, getting more output for the same input.
So working smarter, not just harder.
That's a good way to think about it. Higher productivity means we can produce more goods and services with the same amount of labor hours and the same amount of machinery. It's often linked to improvements in efficiency, better management practices, innovation, and technological advancements.
And increases in aggregate supply mean the economy can grow sustainably.
Yes. When aggregate supply increases because we have more labor, more capital, or higher productivity, it essentially expands the economy's potential output.
Potential output.
Think of potential output as the maximum sustainable level of output the economy can produce when all its resources, labor, and capital are fully utilized, without causing excessive inflation. Increases in aggregate supply shift this potential outwards.
So a healthy economy needs both strong demand to buy the goods and services and the growing supply capacity to actually produce them.
Absolutely. You need both sides working together for sustainable long-term growth.
Now, economies don't just grow in a smooth, straight line, do they? We see periods of boom and sometimes bust. That's the business cycle, right?
Exactly. The business cycle refers to these fluctuations in the actual rate of economic growth relative to the economy's potential output growth. It's characterized by periods of faster growth and periods of slower growth, or even contractions.
Ups and downs.
And governments and central banks often use policy tools, particularly monetary policy, adjusting interest rates, to try and smooth out these fluctuations and keep the economy closer to its potential.
The source mentioned an upswing phase and a downturn phase. Can you give us a quick rundown of what those look like?
Sure. In an upswing or expansion phase, you typically see strong GDP growth. Businesses are investing, hiring picks up, so employment grows strongly, and the unemployment rate starts to decline.
Sounds good.
It generally is. But as the economy starts to operate closer to its full capacity, you might also see inflationary pressures start to build up. Prices start rising more quickly.
Any examples?
The period from around 2005 to 2008 in Australia was a good example of an upswing. It was fueled by high commodity prices, boosting our exports, and significant investment in the mining sector.
Right, the mining boom.
Exactly. And during that time, because inflation was picking up, the Reserve Bank of Australia was actually increasing the cash rate interest rates to try and cool things down a bit and keep inflation in check.
Okay, so that's the upswing. What about the downturn?
A downturn or contraction phase is the opposite. It's characterized by slower GDP growth, sometimes even negative growth, which is a recession. Employment growth slows or reverses, and unfortunately, the unemployment rate tends to increase. Inflationary pressures usually ease off.
And an example there.
Well, the most dramatic recent example globally was the 2008 global financial crisis. It triggered a sharp downturn in many economies. Australia fared better than most, but still experienced a significant slowdown in growth.
And the policy response.
In response to downturns, central banks typically do the opposite of what they do in upswings. They lower interest rates, sometimes quite aggressively, to try and stimulate aggregate demand, encourage C&I, and support economic activity. That's what the RBA did following the GFC.
The diagram in the source material really helped visualize this cycle.
Yes, it typically shows time on the horizontal axis and the level of GDP on the vertical. You see a line representing potential GDP, usually growing steadily upwards over time.
Right.
And then you see the line for actual GDP, fluctuating around that potential line, going above it during booms or upswings, often associated with lower unemployment, but rising inflation, and falling below it during downturns or recessions, usually marked by higher unemployment and lower inflation.
That paints a clear picture of the cyclical nature of economic activity. Now, bringing it all together, the source also touched on how different parts of the economy contribute to overall GDP growth. It's not just a uniform push from all sectors, is it?
No, absolutely not. It's more like a team effort, where different players contribute differently at different times. Each component of aggregate demand, CIG, and net exports, XM, contribute to GDP growth.
But not equally.
Not necessarily. The size of that contribution depends on two things. First, how big that component is as a share of the total economy, and second, how fast that component is growing.
Okay, size and growth rate.
Exactly. For instance, household consumption, C, makes up a very large portion of overall GDP in Australia, maybe around 60%. And it tends to grow relatively steadily most of the time because people's basic spending needs don't fluctuate wildly.
So because it's big and fairly stable?
No, it almost always makes a significant positive contribution to overall GDP growth year after year. It's like the reliable engine room.
That makes sense. What about some of the smaller or more volatile components, like the investment we talked about?
Right. Take mining investment in Australia again.
Yeah.
As a share of the whole economy, it's much smaller than consumption.
However,
It went through huge swings.
exactly. It experienced massive growth during the resources boom, contributing hugely to GDP growth then. But when the boom ended, mining investment fell sharply, which then acted as a major drag on GDP growth for several years.
So even a relatively small part of the economy can have a really big impact on the change in GDP if its own growth rate is very high or very negative. Precisely. Its contribution to growth can be disproportionately large, either positively or negatively because of that volatility. The bar chart included in the source material really illustrated this well for the period 2007-08 to 2017-18.
Yeah, you could see consumption as this big, steady block, while investment and net exports had much bigger swings in their contributions over time.
It shows that dynamic interplay.
Yeah.
Understanding these different contributions helps us see what's really driving or holding back economic growth at any given point in time. It's not just one single number.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into the fundamentals of economic growth and GDP. We've really unpacked quite a lot.
We have.
What economic growth means, that increase in real production, how it's measured using GDP, looking at production, income, and expenditure, and the importance of real versus nominal.
And also GDP's limitations, what it doesn't measure, like well-being or inequality.
Right. And then the key drivers. Aggregate demand with its components,
Yeah.
CIG, XM, and the multiplier effect.
An aggregate supply, driven by labor, capital, and that crucial factor, productivity.
Plus, the whole idea of the business cycle, the ups and downs around potential growth, and how different sectors contribute differently to the overall picture.
Yeah, it's a complex system, but understanding these building blocks is essential.
Absolutely. It's clear that understanding these concepts is crucial for anyone wanting to grasp the bigger picture of how economies function and progress and, make sense of the news.
Definitely. And hopefully this discussion has provided you, the listener, with a solid foundation.
So here's a final thought to leave you with, building on everything we've discussed. Considering what we've unpacked about the drivers of economic growth, demand, supply, productivity, and also the limitations of GDP as a measure of overall progress, what do you think is the most important factor for a country to focus on for genuine long-term prosperity and well-being?
That's a big question. Is it just about boosting that GDP number, or is it more about productivity, or maybe how the gains are distributed? Or sustainability.
Lots to consider there. Definitely food for thought. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the economist's mind.